So right at the start of my career in advertising, we I along with a bunch of other people were interning, doing a kind of immersion program at this one agency. I believe it was Publicis, under the recommendation of the agency's creative director at the time, a Marlon Rivera, who was also my one of my professors back in uni. Very interesting guy. Like I said, so the entire thing was just an immersion into the entire process of how they tend to do things, because it really put a lot of what we learned in uni into practice. One of those times that really stood out for me was I was asking Marlon in terms of any kind of semblance or process, like thought process of what he had when it comes to thinking about um, how he does the work, how he comes up with inspiration, how does he make sure, how does it come to him in a way that feels convincingly correct in regards to how to solve a particular problem, which is when it comes to advertising, it's what you do essentially every day. So he told me about a particular process, and it's not exactly like a mind blowing process, but it was like interesting to think about at the time. And what he described to me essentially was his morning routine before getting to the office. He wakes up, he gets ready, just like anyone else. He always starts the day by going to a cafe, getting his typical order, sitting outside, uh, drinking his coffee, kind of like being alone with his thoughts. And as much as I wanted to ask about some kind of process, he essentially just explained it right there, like in what he does, just sitting there alone with his thoughts, ideas would just come to him. And I mean, as a young person back then in this profession, of course, I was like impressed, and everyone else, all my friends were impressed too. Um, but over the years, I would always come back to it and try and wonder, was there more to it? Like, how does it happen? Because it seemed like very like serendipitous in terms of like he just sits there and it comes to him. Of course, in my head, I'm thinking like, well, wow, I wish I had that power. Some decades later, I'm reading this book. It's called Bored Brilliant by, I believe, a Manoush Zomoradi. I hope I didn't butcher that name. And so when I was reading this book, it's when the Marlin example kept sticking out to me because it kind of connected things one to one there. So the book is called Bored and Brilliant because the essential um, idea of the book in itself is that boredom is essential in harboring any kind of like forward thought or even creativity. So like the abstract of it is like boredom becomes a kind of benefit for you, um, through sitting there being alone with your own thoughts. Um, Not to give anything too much away from the book in itself, but when you're free of distractions, and especially now in these modern times, we got phones, we got all these different types of gadgets taking space in our mind. Once you're free of all that, your mind essentially becomes a kind of incubator lab that helps process the thoughts that are already percolating in your brain into forward movement, into ideas, into things that you can then apply to whatever it is that you're working on at the time. So to bring it full circle, this early on in the video, like that's really how I saw it when I came back to the Marlin example. He was essentially sitting there in his own thoughts. I understand now, like his brain was essentially percolating. Um, as the book described, when you're essentially uh, bored, that term really gets a really bad rap because I mean it doesn't, it never seems positive, but there's a lot of positive benefits when it comes to it, because when you're bored, your mind essentially enters what it's called like a kind of default state. Through that, it is able to um, index your thoughts better. It's able to make certain connections more possible. It allows your mind to explore a bit so that you would come to more nuanced conclusions in this sense. So, like, this is why like things like shower thoughts become really popular. Like being alone in your own thoughts, you come up with these crazy ideas. That's essentially where this is all headed. And I found that really interesting in regards to um, how this is really important towards the process. Because in reflecting back in my time in advertising, like I don't feel you ever really get the chance to do that. It's always here's the brief, now go brainstorm. And there, your brain is essentially contending with other people in the room towards trying to figure out a solution for a particular problem. And the thing is, um, because because you're dealing with other people, your brain is not exactly at that default state, that you don't feel you're giving out the what may be quality ideas in hindsight. Because again, as much as a collaborative aspect brainstorming is, in some ways it's still kind of like a mental argument that you have with other people in the room. I'm not saying it's in a sense of like, oh, my idea is better. No, my idea is better. You still have to convince everyone that what you thought is the best way forward, when in reality, the fact that you're dealing with other people, again, your brain hasn't completely thought out applications for the thought that you had. Yes, ideally, in a brainstorming situation, it's the other people that would help bridge that gap for you. But I feel, having read this book, some alone time would really benefit coming up with more nuanced thoughts on how to tackle a particular problem that you're having. What interested me is like there's actually a lot of science behind this notion as well. Um, so there's a psychologist named Dr. Sandy Mann. One of the experiments that he conducted that really stood out to me was like this cup experiment, where he had a number of people and he placed a simple paper cup in front of them and asked them to figure out to come up with as many ideas of how to use this as they can. So obviously you have one singular object, you'd feel the task in itself is boring. But the surprising results is a lot of people really engaged with it. And the fact that you kind of have this limited aspect of what you're dealing with, just like the single cup, um, again, it gets you to that default state. It allows your brain to explore a bit, to try and be a bit more creative in how you can use this. So obviously, a lot of the responses weren't just merely the cup as a mode of drinking. I mean, a lot of people would come up with ideas like, here's the cup as a hat. Here it is as earrings. One standout example was, here is the cup as like Madonna's bra. So you can kind of see how with limited stimulation per se, it, I don't want to say it forces your brain, but I mean, because it's kind of intuitive in your brain is my point, that when you're in that kind of scenario, that it's going to figure out the answer for you. Like I said, like your brain is making those connections, and then you will essentially figure it out. At least come up with a more nuanced way of trying to figure it out as well. Going back to the brainstorming analogy, there was another psychologist named Jonathan Smallwood, where he was essentially making that point that I was trying to explain earlier about um, when you're essentially in a kind of argument, your brain is more engaged with trying to deal with the other person rather than trying to understand or trying to figure out the issue at hand. Anyone who's ever been in a kind of argument will always have, I mean, or any kind of like 1-2 person interaction, say like a job interview, for example. Without fail, anyone that goes through a job interview, the second they walk out that room, they'll start thinking about, oh my God, I should have said this, I should have said this, I forgot to talk about this. So again, it's the fact that your brain was more engaged in trying to cater to the other person in the room, that your brain, it never occurred to you to come up with these things. And that's essentially it in regards to it's like usually after the interaction, when you're on your drive home, it's when you're trying to play back the interaction in your head, and that's when all the ideas start coming up. Like it doesn't sound ideal, but and I'm not giving recommendations on how to do this and how to apply this, but I think we can agree that it is essential. Because, like, again, when you think about things like shower thoughts, the main conceit about shower thoughts, especially when it's been memeified in the internet, it's like the thoughts, while simple, they're always so profound. Because when it's profound, it's always like it's connecting to multiple things that you never normally connect things with. And that's what makes the thought nuanced. Like, I think a key anecdote for me is when I was younger, I would always join my family to Sunday Mass. And whenever it gets to the priest doing a sermon, sorry, but that's when my brain tends to clock out a bit. And that's when I really start daydreaming. And daydreaming is a really key component in trying to get these types of, and trying to get this kind of mindset and thought process. It's when I'm sitting there just waiting for the sermon to end, when ideas come to me, whether it's things I want to do, or in my case, I'm a musician, and that's when specific like melodies come to my head, and I can't wait to like actually realize them once I'm back home and on front of a guitar, things like that. Essentially, like daydreaming helps make sense of what's complicated before. So I'm not saying with certain systems like brainstorming that it's broken, but I mean, there's always time to improve upon what was initially thought of and devised during that initial brainstorming. So again, that will happen. Once you have time to yourself, you might think of something better, and that is completely normal in the industry of advertising, where we come up with a confident idea one day, and then the next day we have a better idea and just completely scrap the previous day. You're not so distraught about scrapping the prior idea because you actually believe in the second idea more. So I think the key thing here is, again, with all the different types of distractions that we have these days, you really have to be mindful on like letting yourself be bored. So for example, when I'm folding laundry, I always try and make sure that I have some kind of YouTube video playing so my mind is occupied. But once you realize the benefits of boredom, you kind of try and seek it out now. You're trying to reclaim that space and time and space back to have thoughts about, to try and let your brain explore essentially. So like any menial task is what I'd recommend. Any menial task that you're going through, just give into it. Like let it happen. Through that, you're letting your mind explore. You might be surprised as to where it takes you. Again, a lot of these key concepts came from the Bored and Brilliant book by Manus Murati. Again, I hope I'm not butchering that name. I'm still halfway through the book, but like the initial concept of it was fascinating enough that it had me reflect on all the times I've been bored or could have been bored, and especially going back full circle to the Marlon anecdote of like, now I understand where he's coming from. And and I'm not saying that now that I understand this, I could do that, but you can kind of see a way there. And that's all you can hope for at this point. So go for it. Be bored.